Somos más y no tenemos miedo. Somos más y no tenemos miedo. Yeah. Hola, me llamo Alba Mar. Me pueden decir Alba. El canal se llama Seriela. Estamos aquí para hablar de libros, aunque no lo crea. Yes, my name is Alba Mar. You may call me Alba. The channel name is Seriela. And we're here to talk about books, even though you might have been a little surprised. Yeah, I just want to show off my new earrings. Yeah. They're made by Astrid Raquel, and she's on Facebook. Look at that. That's the flag of resistance. Yeah. This flag appeared first when the Fiscal Control Board was designated over Puerto Rico. And so that flag has been a symbol of resistance since then. And what you see hanging from the flag of resistance is a cacerola, a pot, like this one, a pot. And that's what people have used, not only here in Puerto Rico, but in a lot of other different countries. And that's the spoon. And they use it to protest, especially the grandmothers in Argentina. They would celebrate a cacerolazo. They would have these pot-hitting protests weekly when the economic crisis in Argentina. And that's some of the things that people do here to protest, el cacerolazo. So you got a little inkling of that. And that's Astrid Raquel, and she's on Facebook, and I will link it down below. I love our crafts people. They're so creative and imaginative. Oh, I loved it. So today we're going to talk again about nonfiction, but this time my favorite nonfiction Puerto Rican books. But first I'm going to start with some almost favorites. Because there have been a lot of good Puerto Rican nonfiction books that I have read lately. This one that you saw recently, and I finished Signing in Puerto Rican, which I didn't realize qualified for Disability-a-thon, which was taking place, or maybe still taking place, on Instagram. Yeah, and I think I'll link the channels if I find the channels down below. And this is written by Andres Torres, and it's the story of a hearing son and his deaf family. What happens, this deaf family on both sides had deaf people. His father was deaf and his mother was deaf. And he tells the story of the entire family here and his position as a hearing son, and not only his position, but his hearing cousins' positions as interpreters in these three cultures, because there were three languages being spoken here. This was a marvelous, marvelous book. Three languages: Spanish, hearing Spanish, home signing Spanish, American Sign Language, and English. A lot of stuff going on. Yeah, this was fascinating read. Then you heard my caveats in a recent video about the unsolved case of Dr. Cornelius P. Rhoads, an indictment about by Pedro Aponte Vázquez, which is about a cover-up of the possible murder of 8 patients at the hands of Dr. Cornelius P. Rhoads, and how that was covered up. Right? Very important story in the medical history of Puerto Rico. Then Mariana Bracety, who was the one who, according to legend, sewed the flag for the revolt of Lares in 1868. And she was, I think she was the only woman, definitely the only mother who was jailed along with her minor children after that revolt. She was a fascinating woman. She was married 3 times. The last time, her husband was 20 years her junior. Struggled a lot, but very, very independent and strong. Mariana Bracety, by Raquel Rosario Rivera. And then I just finished, finally, Truman y Puerto Rico, The Origin of a Failed Decolonization Project by Ángel Collado Schwartz. And I already told you that Ángel Collado Schwartz is a person who has broadcast weekly a radio program where he interviews many authors, historians, academics, all sorts of figures in Puerto Rico, and has a library of all those interviews on his website. And later on I will be talking about some of those interviews with my favorite books, and I will provide links to those interviews for anybody who is interested and who understands Spanish. This was a very well documented, researched look at how Truman, with the help of the U.S. Navy under the leadership of Admiral Leahy, forged the new project, which was called, in English, the Commonwealth, in Spanish, el Estado Libre Asociado, after the Second World War, and the reasons why the United States and the Navy thought that that change, that cosmetic change, was needed. I especially like the last part. The whole thing was very good. It established a historical context, yes, for everything that happened before the Second World War, but then especially after the Second World War, he goes into a lot of in-depth analysis about what happened there. So I recommend this book, and I hope that it comes out in English very soon. So, which are my favorite books? My favorite books are these. Chronologically, this I read in around 1971, I remember. I was in New York at the time. I wasn't in Puerto Rico. I was in the city of New York, and I read this book, and it opened my eyes to a lot of what was happening in Puerto Rico and what was impacting me and shocking me about what I was observing in Puerto Rico. This book, Puerto Rico, una interpretación histórico-social by Manuel Maldonado Dennis, who was a professor at the University of Puerto Rico. This book actually has an English translation, and I will link it down below. Puerto Rico, Historical Social Interpretation. Has a lot of history right there. I have the sticky notes still there. There's history, politics from 1898 to 1940, a lot of economy. Explains a lot of the economy and the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. I have this all marked up. I love this book. It opened my eyes. Another book that I really enjoyed is this one, Gilberto, el abogado de la patria. Unfortunately, this one does not come in English. It's in Spanish. It's about Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia, who was the founder, one of the founders of the Puerto Rican Independence Party in around 1946, 1948, before 1950. As soon as the Popular Democratic Party eliminated the independence option from its platform, the Puerto Rican Independence Party was formed. There came a moment in history, and that's why I love this book, where he had to defend soldiers that were fighting in Korea, Puerto Rican soldiers who were called borinqueños. I will link the Wikipedia article down below. 93 of whom were court-martialed en masse during the Korean War. And how Don Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia and the Colegio de Abogados, the Lawyers Association, got together and defended those soldiers. And here in this book, Collado Schwartz only says that there were secret negotiations between the United States and the colonial government of Puerto Rico. Yeah, they said secret negotiations were taking place, and that's how the soldiers were acquitted, pardoned, acquitted, set free. But here, in an article, chapter 2, by another lawyer called Carlos Mondriguez Torres, he tells the story of what happened to those soldiers, how it came to be that 93 Puerto Rican soldiers were court-martialed, and how they got them free. Fascinating story. I wish they would do a documentary of this, a television miniseries, a movie, because it was absolutely engrossing, this chapter of Gilberto, abogado de la patria. Then, La farsa del Estado Libre Asociado by licenciado Vicente Heigel Polanco. Vicente Heigel Polanco, oh, let me see, he was so many things. He was a co-founder of the Popular Democratic Party, which was the one that pushed for Commonwealth status, right? Which is no change in status at all. And when he started noticing that there was no change at all, he started writing articles and columns in the newspapers, alerting people to the fact that this was a farce, that the Commonwealth, Estado Libre Asociado, I've mentioned before, has been translated incorrectly into English as the Commonwealth. It's not a Commonwealth. In any way, shape, or form, Puerto Rico is not a Commonwealth. But it was accepted. As was accepted Estado Libre Asociado, which is not an Estado, not a state, not libre, not free, not associated. No es asociado. And in a series of articles and columns, Vicente Heigel Polanco started alerting people to that fact. And it was like the proverbial prophet in the desert that nobody wanted to listen to at the time. Now, we have to remember that in 1951, when all of this was taking place, these changes, there had been a revolt, and I'll talk about that in another video. It's take too much time. There had been a revolt in 1950 across many towns and cities in Puerto Rico, and thousands of independence supporters were in jail. were in jail. And not only were thousands of independence supporters in jail, there was a gag law, la mordaza, which didn't even permit people to have the Puerto Rican flag. It was considered a crime. And to talk about independence and to be an independence supporter, there was a lot of repression. So people weren't listening to poor Vicente Hegel Polanco. But on the 20th anniversary of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, he published this book through Editorial Edil. That was 1972. And that was the copy that I read the first time, the copy in 1972. Couldn't find it. I guess I loaned it out to somebody. And then I found this one. Well, I'd have to go to the bookstore and get it. And this one was reprinted in 2010, with a prologue by Carmelo Delgado Cintrón and a wonderful series of articles about Vicente Hegel Polanco, the historical context, what was happening at the time, the culture, everything about the author and about what was happening in Puerto Rico at the time. Oh, and that introduction takes about 50 pages, 62 pages of introduction. So I'm so glad I found this edition of La Farsa del Estado Libre Asociado, the farce of the Commonwealth, Puerto Rico. Love this book. Oh. Los Chinos en Puerto Rico by Jose Lee Borges, Chinese in Puerto Rico. This is a professor at the University of Puerto Rico. His father was Chinese, his mother was Cuban. He traces the history of Chinese in Puerto Rico, but starting way back in China, and explains what was happening in China that spurred so many Chinese to have this huge diaspora all over the world, because you know that there are Chinese all over the world. What was happening in China that spurred that movement? He talks about that. And then he connects it to the Caribbean, because the Chinese that wound up in Puerto Rico came from Cuba. They were indentured laborers that came to cut cane in Cuba after slavery had been abolished. Or around that time. There was still slavery, but they were getting ready for that transition. So the Cuban plantation owners sent for Chinese indentured servants. Then when those Chinese indentured servants realized that they were basically working in the same conditions as black slaves, basically the same conditions, they revolted. And many of them committed suicide, and sometimes mass suicides. But they revolted, and many of them were jailed. And where were they jailed? In Puerto Rico. They had to serve time in Puerto Rico. And some of those penal laborers were the ones who constructed our central roadways in the mountains. Many lost their lives in that construction. But that road is one of the best constructed engineering feats in Puerto Rico before the turn of the century. Yeah, this was a fantastic, engrossing read. To me, it read like a novel. Loved it. I hope he does another one. Hope he does another one. And then, last but not least, my favorite of all time is Two Lynchings on Cerro Maravilla, the police murders in Puerto Rico and the federal government cover-up, by Manuel Manny Suarez, who was a reporter at the San Juan Star at the time. This book has a foreword by Samuel Dash, who was involved in a Watergate case. And that foreword is based on an interview that was given to Pulitzer Prize winning author William Kennedy. Yes. I try to read this every year in July, and those first pages always make me cry because Manny Suarez starts it right there when it happens, and it is heartbreaking. And what is more heartbreaking and shocking is the cover-up. And not only was it covered up once, it was covered up at least twice. Yeah, so this is another fantastic read, and I highly recommend it. So those were my favorite nonfiction books from Puerto Rico, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment down below if you want, and I thank you for your time. Cuídense mucho, mi gente. Sigan leyendo. Adiós.